Thank you very much. And it's hard to follow Ty. He does such a great job. As Dr. Everman told you, my name is Dr. Rhonda Miller, and I'm with Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. And my expertise, while I do a lot of the same things that Ty does, but I've kind of segmented my professional expertise more towards sensory evaluation. So Dr. Lawrence and I butt up to each other, and actually Dr. Lawrence will be taking samples of the carcasses. That's the last thing he'll do after he grades them and assigns any discounts to them. He will provide me with 2 strip loins. And my job is to do sensory evaluation. So, you know, that question about eating, that's what I get to do. And so what I really want to do today is talk to you. Sorry, let me get this. I want to talk to you a little bit about what meat descriptive evaluation is, so you understand what we're going to be doing, and kind of give you an introduction to our sensory facilities at Texas A&M and why we do what we do. And in the last part, especially as this dovetails into the third presentation, is I'm going to talk about the relationship of what we're doing and what we're measuring to consumer liking. And as I said, I'm a sensory scientist as well. I'm a traditionally trained animal science, meat scientist. And throughout my career, I kept getting more and more interested in sensory. And I've been at Texas A&M now 33 years, and I've been in charge of our sensory evaluation facility. And so why sensory evaluation? And I really like this graphic because it kind of puts sensory evaluation in perspective. So in the middle of this graphic is consumer behavior. I think as a beef industry, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give the consumer what they want, and there are different things that drive consumer behavior. You notice psychological factors, marketing factors, but notice that sensory is one of those. So my job is to measure the yellow. And as a sensory scientist, what I do is I'm going to use Hamburger Man. This is my Hamburger Man, and I might refer back to Hamburger Man throughout my talk. But what I do as a sensory scientist is I evoke a sensory response. What does that mean? I have people eat the steak or the sample, and therefore all of their senses, all 5 senses, whether that's visual or when they put it in their mouth, what they feel in their mouth, flavor, which includes basic taste on the tongue, sweet, sour, salt, bitter, umami, or what they detect as far as the olfactory bulb. And then odor is what you smell, the odors that you smell, and flavor and odor aromatics are both detected by the olfactory bulb. They just get there by different paths. And we know that when consumers evaluate product, and notice visual appearances here, and Ty talked about dark cutters and why that's discounted, because consumers first purchase with their eyes. We know that color, marbling, how much fat is on that product is really important to consumers for selection and purchase. And then once they get that product home and they eat it, and we talked a lot about that in our chat box about what we like to eat, their continued purchase is driven by their in-mouth texture, flavor, and odor. Because once they eat it, their sense organs send information to the brain, and the brain records that perception and sends out a response. Now, as a sensory scientist, what I'm responsible for is taking the steaks from the cattle that you're producing and giving them to humans to provide a stimulus or evoke a response, and then measure that response. And notice that there's some things that go on in between there that I try to control as a scientist. And so I have a lot of fun with this. And if you ever come to Clayburgh Center, sometimes you walk into our building on campus at Texas A&M and it smells like somebody's cooking steaks. That's me up on the 3rd floor, or my students. But I do want to make sure that you understand that this is a science. As a sensory professional, I call myself, I'm a meat scientist, animal scientist first, and a sensory scientist second, but I am very much involved in the sensory world. I'm a member of the Society of Sensory Professionals. I'm a member of IFT and the sensory group of IFT. And I'm also a member of the American Society of Testing Materials International E18, and I teach sensory evaluation at Texas A&M. So there are a lot of people in the US that don't even really know I'm a meat scientist. They think of me as a sensory scientist, and they think of me as somebody who produces other sensory scientists. And my students work not only in the meat industry, but in the food industry in general. But most importantly, I'm a member of the American Society of our American Meat Science Association, and I'm one of the authors of the research guidelines for cookery, sensory evaluation, and instrumental tenderness. And that's very important because as a meat scientist, I want to make sure that when I give you data back, after you put all these resources into producing these cattle, I need to tell you whether the eating qualities of those animals was acceptable or unacceptable, and what the tenderness was, what the flavor was. Now I know that Mr. Brinker's going to do some other things with them, and I'm excited to hear about that. But my job is, from a scientific standpoint, to give you quantitative data that assesses the eating quality of these animals. And that's why Ty's going to give me 2 steaks. And one of those steaks I am going to feed to my panel. And the other one, I'm going to do a mechanical measurement of tenderness. So the one thing you need to know about me is that I'm a control freak. My graduate students would tell you that I'm always asking questions. Are you doing this right? Are you doing that right? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but I want you to know that I spend a lot of my time doing panel training, orientation. I control a lot of the product variables, especially cooking variables, the time of day. I worry about how my panelists are doing, if they're happy, if they're able to be a quantitative individual that day, or if something else is going on. And I also control the environment. So let me just walk through the big highlights here so you can understand. So the first thing I have here in the lower left-hand corner is I have 2 steaks. One is a steak that's just recently been placed on this grill. We control the temperature of this grill. This is a 1-inch thick stainless steel plate, a flat grill that's used in very commonly in the industry. You notice that each of these steaks have wires coming from them, because we insert in the geometric center of each steak a thermocouple so we can monitor the cook temperature. We weigh the steaks before we cook them. We measure the amount of time it takes to cook the steak. We monitor the internal temperature when they go on, and we remove these steaks when they've reached an internal temperature of 70.0 degrees C. Sometimes we miss that by a couple of tenths, and so we record the actual final internal temperature. Then we weigh them afterwards so that we can get total cook time, total cook yield, internal temperature. And you'll notice that in the middle picture, we have a picture of the temperature recording device that we use, and we have very tight controls on this. In fact, we have a game that we play to make sure they come off at 70.0 degrees, and they get treats if they do a good job. And then from the sensory standpoint, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that freshly cooked steak, and now I'm going to serve it to humans who have been trained. And they're going to be seated in a booth. And I talked here about the environment. I control the environment. Now, that picture that's on the right-hand side is red. That isn't because I'm a really bad photographer, and I'm not a good photographer by any means. But that's because our trained panelists are going to evaluate these samples under red lights so that the visual appearance doesn't influence them, because they are not consumers. They will tell me quantitatively about the tenderness, the flavor, and the juiciness of this steak. I'm not asking them what they like, what they don't like. In fact, if they tell me what they like and they don't like, they actually get a little quarter goes into the pot. I don't want to know what they like. I want them to think like a human instrument, like a gas chromatograph, to give me a quantitative value. So what do we use? We use what we call meat descriptive sensory evaluation. This is what was originally described in the American Meat Science Association sensory guidelines. And there are different methods, different sensory tools, but this is the tool that we choose to use for these animals in this project because it gives us a real good understanding of the quantitative value of tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. And so I have trained descriptive panelists. I've been doing this for over 40 years, and I work with the panelists. My panelists are considered expert panelists, which means that they've had more than 200 hours of training. Actually, my panelists have had more than 600 hours because they work all the time, and I train for every new project. And I wanted to point this out because I just don't pull people off the street. When people ask me, what do you do? And I tell them I eat meat for a living, they always say, can I do that too? And I'm like, well, it's not as easy as you think, because I have to alter these people mentally to be quantitative. And I do follow the AMSA sensory guidelines. It would be, I would be in trouble if I didn't, since I'm one of the authors and I've made significant contributions to those guidelines. A lot of the things that I do in my lab are recorded in those guidelines. So that's, I know that's not that much information, but I hope what I've done with that information is help you to understand that I have a highly trained descriptive attribute panel, that I use humans, that I can quantitate eating quality, so that in Hamburger Man, when I give my panelists a sample and I measure their response, I have some control over what that response is. So for meat descriptive attributes, what we originally, back in the early 1900s, when they developed quality grading and yield grading, on a quality grading, they said, we need a system that measures the palatability or eating quality. And so as Dr. Lawrence described to you, he described that system and where we are today. But what's really interesting is those individuals who wrote those specifications said what was important to consumers was juiciness and tenderness and flavor of beef. I've gone through the literature. There's no literature in the early 1900s that ever documented that in a valuable scientific way. But they were right. And as we have gone through the 1900s, we've been able to document that the drivers of consumer life, what they like, is they like juiciness, muscle fiber tenderness, and flavor. So what the original meat descriptive attributes measured each of these, the juiciness, muscle fiber tenderness. Muscle fiber tenderness is, as you chew down, how the muscle fibers fall apart and how much force there is as you're chewing. Connective tissue amount is how much of that steak, as you bite down and chew, how much of it doesn't fall apart because of connective tissue that's holding the muscle bundles together. And we don't want connective tissue. Some of you who said you like fillets because you don't want any connective tissue. And if any of you had put down that you like bottom round steaks, I would have worried about you a little bit, because those high use muscles from the forequarter and the hindquarter that are used to help the animal walk and run have higher connective tissue. And so we want to measure that. And then we use overall tenderness as a measure of muscle fiber tenderness and connective tissue amount. Now, as an industry and as a meat science community, we used to just measure something called flavor intensity. This was prior to the 1990s, and you put the sample in your mouth and you determined whether it was bland or intense in flavor. Now, for all of these attributes, we used 8-point scales. where 1 was the worst case scenario and 8 was the best case scenario. And you reported these in a quantitative manner. And this is what a ballot looked like. Now I'm going to tell you, when I was in graduate school, this is what I was trained to do as a panelist. This is what I trained my panelists to do, both at Colorado State and at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center. And then I came to Texas A&M after a stint in industry, and I had worked in product development for a company called Monfort for 4.5 years, worked with chefs, and I found out that flavor was really important. And here, as meat scientists, all we were measuring was flavor intensity. So the first thing that happened was we started measuring some components of flavor. We added cooked beef brothy, that beefy flavor, and cooked beef fat, because we had identified those as important characteristics. But look at the lower right-hand corner. There are a bunch of off-flavor characteristics. So we started measuring those characteristics and assigning a number to them. Well, that's great. And I can tell you that those of us who grew up doing meat descriptive attribute, we all know what a 6 is for muscle fiber tenderness and a 5 is for juiciness and so forth. But you know what? Eating a steak is more than that. And as consumers have changed, we know that flavor has become more and more important. And this is just a picture of the olfactory bulb, whether through smell over here, or as we're chewing, volatile aromatics are transported to the olfactory bulb, where chemical compounds or some chemical compounds are activated by receptors in the olfactory bulb, and that then sends a sense to the brain. So I think if I use the word skunk, all of you would know what I'm talking about. That's an aromatic volatile compound at a very high concentration. And we know that beef has a lot of volatile compounds. In fact, we've measured over 344 volatile compounds. And I have a colleague, Dr. Chris Kirk, and there's some other gentlemen as well across the US that measure those volatile compounds. But I wasn't ever really good at organic chemistry. So I came back to the sensory, and we developed what we called a beef flavor lexicon. This is my friend Koshek Adahari and I did this research. And what we did is we said, we need to measure flavor with a better understanding of what the flavor really is in the beef. And this is really important for the cattle in this study, because we know they're going to be, they've been grown, they've gone through the stocker phase, now they're going into the feedlot. And once they've gone through feedlot feeding and they're ready to be harvested, we want to know how those animals taste. What are the flavor? We want to know their juiciness. We need to know their tenderness, but we need to understand flavor attributes. And I'm just going to give you an example. There are a number of attributes, as you can see in the flavor lexicon, but a lexicon is just a dictionary of terms that identifies an attribute. Let's just look here at beef identity. And then it defines what that is. That's the amount of beef flavor identified in a sample. And then it gives references. References are where I could serve all of you Swanson's beef broth, and I would tell you the beef identity in that is a 5. And then I can give you 80% lean ground beef and have you eat that and tell you it's a little bit higher. It's a 7. And we measure these things using a 0 to 15 point scale, where 0 means none, nothing is in there, and 15 is extremely intense, and it can be higher if it needs to be. But the value of this is, as a sensory scientist, I send this to Australia. I can send this to my colleagues at Kansas State, to my colleagues at Colorado State, to Texas Tech, to everybody, and we will be on the same at the same level and understand things at the same amount. And we also include basic tastes of sweet, salt, bitter, umami, and we have references that will help people to identify them, and then we can have the same repeated assessment of the quantity. So now this is what my ballot looks like. It's a lot more complicated, isn't it? And I want to point out that I have a bunch of flavor attributes here. Some of these you probably don't really want to think about: animal hair, barnyard. We don't find those some of those attributes. Those are minor attributes in beef unless something has really gone wrong. So I have the major attributes. I have some of the minor attributes that we find. And then I have juiciness, muscle fiber tenderness, and connective tissue. Now, what I've done here is we still measure those like we always have, but I've converted them to the 15-point scale so that we have a uniform scaling for all of these. Now, why do I do this? And the biggest question I get asked, because I want you to know, I spend a lot of time and effort keeping those panelists trained. When really what you as producers and people that are involved in beef production, you want to know, are we producing something that consumers like? And so what I want to do in these last couple of slides is show you that what I do in the lab with my trained panelists is related to consumer liking, because it costs a lot of money to do consumer testing. And I travel all over the US doing consumer testing. And in this biplot, what I want you to see is that I have, first of all, over here on the right-hand side in blue, I have consumer attributes. This is a large consumer study where we gave consumers steaks and roasts, and things were cooked differently, and boy, they all tasted different. They were different in juiciness and tenderness and flavor. And we asked them, what do you like? And they told us. And so in blue, these are consumer liking, and overall liking here is here in the middle. And notice that's where we're trying to go. We want them to really like what they are doing. And then we also did the train panel, like what we're doing for this project. And those attributes are in red. And you should recognize some of these words now that I didn't go through all of them because we only have a little bit of time here. But what I want you to look at is we want the red attributes to be as close as possible to the blue. That means they're highly related. This is a multivariate technique that I use all the time. Well, what is the red attribute that's closest to the blue? Fat-like. Oh, didn't Ty just talk to us about that? He did. He talked about quality grade and why it's important. You want to know why quality grade is important and why those meat scientists, clear back in the early 1900s when they developed quality grades, they were really right, even though they didn't have the data to prove it. But boy, the first time I looked at this, I jumped up in my desk and I cheered because fat-like is right there. Other things that are important, look at brown roasted, beef identity, umami. They want it to taste like beef. People like the flavor of beef. Those attributes are closely related to fat-like. Other attributes that are important, look where overall tenderness and juiciness are. They're very closely related to consumer tenderness and juiciness liking, but they're just a little farther off. We can see the flavor attributes, some of those flavor attributes are closest related to overall liking. And our consumers today, flavor is a little bit bigger driver, but juiciness and tenderness are still really, really important. We can't leave them out. And look at what's on the left-hand side. Liver-like, cardboardy, and sour aromatic. Those are the attributes, when we have those in the meat, that consumers say, I don't like it. And we're going to be measuring those. Now, there's another attribute in here that so you can see liver-like and cardboardy. When we find that at a 2 or higher, consumers don't like it. Down here in the bottom, I have in green Warner-Brasler shear force. Warner-Brasler shear force is a mechanical measure of the amount of force required to segment half-inch cores. We cook steaks exactly the same as we do for train panels, side by side on the same grill. And then we cool it to room temperature. We remove cores and we use a machine, which I'm going to show you a picture of here in a minute, that tells us how much force is required. And so if there's higher force, it's tougher. So it's over here on this side, away from tenderness, because we want really low numbers. And by using the Warner-Bressler shear and the human estimate of tenderness, we can get a really good view of how these samples eat. And so this is probably one of the key slides, and I love this slide because fat likes right there. But I also want to tell you, and I have just a couple more slides here, that when we go and talk to consumers after they've eaten beef, and we ask them, what did you like about this beef? What did you dislike about the beef? And they tell us. So it's hard to quantitate that data. We use what we call Wordles. So the more times they say something, the bigger the word. And we give them no prompts. They have to tell us. So this is what heavy and light beef eaters across the United States have told us, that flavor, tenderness, and juiciness are important. And you know what I learned as a sensory scientist, and I think I learned this when I was in an undergraduate, but I didn't know if it was really true. But here, later in my career, I'm asking a consumer, what did you like about that steak? And they would say, it was juicy, it was tender, and it was flavorful. Oh, that's very good. Can you tell me more about the flavor? Well, it's tender, it's juicy, and it's flavorful. They connect all those things together. They aren't like my trained panelists, right? But we know that tenderness, juiciness, and flavor are predominant words here. And these words were generated with no help. These are the things they don't like about beef. If beef is bland, if it's chewy, if it's dry, if it's tough, they don't like it. And those are their own words. So the things we're measuring them so you can get a good understanding of how consumers are going to perceive your product. And so I just wanted to leave you, I showed you some of these pictures here, but we're going to place all the controls so that when we give you data, it is representative of the eating quality of of steaks from that animal. And we are going to make sure that our panelists, they're seated in the booths here. Here are two of my panelists. Here's Ron, one of my panelists who's been with me for about 25 years. And let me tell you, they are trained professionals. And I have the joy of working with them. And I wanted to show you these two pictures because this is the instrument we use for the Warner-Bressler shear. It is the same thing that they use to make sure your airplanes won't fall apart. The metal is strong and all that, but we use it for meat. And we put a core in here, and this moves down and tells us how much force is required to segment the sample. So that's what I'm going to be doing for you with Ty and also with others. So thank you very much.